Now this is a story about, if you're a partisan, as some of us are considered to be, this is a story about a Confederate hero. He's a local guy, and this guy was raised and lived on Sandy Hook. If you know how to go to the Holiday Street, continue on across the river. As you get across the river, the first lane to the right leads, it's a gravel road, and it leads down. You can see a clump of Bradford pear trees blooming there right around the house. This is the house that this young man lived in. And as I say, his name was Levi Crisman Crabill, and he had a brother, a younger brother, that lived there with him, Obed Henry Crabill. Obed Henry Crabill happens to be buried in the Presbyterian church yard right at the top of the hill. The mother lived there, Priscilla, but the father had died. His father, old Mr. Crabill, which is, I think it was Hugh. No, it was Levi. I'm sorry, Levi Crabill was the father. He had passed away, and what made this story so interesting is that she had remarried a guy by the name of Daniel Borden, who came from the area of Woodstock or Maurytown up that way. And this story has been told, about this Crabill guy shooting all these Yankees. And you wonder, could that be so? And when you're a historian, you try to figure out the facts of the thing, and you don't want to tell stories that aren't necessarily true. So you look for evidence of the truth of these stories. And for years I looked, because in this book, this is a book written by David Hunter Strother, and David Hunter Strother was from Berkeley Springs, West Virginia, and he happened to be the chief of staff for General Sigel and then later General Hunter, both of whom came through Strasburg, and we'll get to all of that. This guy writes a narrative about his passing through Strasburg, and on his let's see. Well, on one, I'll get to the date in a minute, but on this certain day, he mentions in here that they burned the Boyden house, Boyden. And I wondered, I have lived here, as Mary has lived here all our lives. I've never figured out where the Boyden house was. I could never figure that out. And all of a sudden, as I was looking at Levi Crisman Crabill and looking at that stuff, I realized, wait a minute, his mother had married a Borden. And Boyden would be a Dutch or German spelling for Borden. And so it is indeed the same house. And so we'll talk about that in a minute. Back to Priscilla in old Levi's will. Priscilla, I don't know about this, but what are we doing? They're practicing. All right. Well, anyway, that's okay. Priscilla had married this Borden guy, and the Great War, broke out, and these guys all joined, as everybody joins, Company A of the 10th Virginia Volunteers, which was organized by Stover here in Strasburg. And Stover also lived over on Sandy Hook, and so these guys knew him. And at 21 years old, Levi Crisman Crabill joined the Confederate Army, Company A, 10th Virginia Volunteers. Very famous, not to digress too far, but very famous for their activity over at Chancellorsville, where Joshua Stover of Strasburg was killed and is, of course, buried over there. Anyhow, the other boy would come along later. Hot dog, we got the door going. In 1861, when these guys enlisted in, oh, it works, it's going both ways, but whatever. In 18, it's distracting. In 1861, these boys joined the infantry, which was the infantry company formed here in Strasburg. But they enlisted, if you look at their enlistment records, which I have looked at in detail, they enlisted for a period of 1 year. Because surely we can drive the Yankees out of Virginia in 1 year. I mean, it couldn't take any longer than that, impossible. But they had this stubborn guy, Lincoln, who decided that, no, we're not ending this thing easily, and the war kept going. But in 1862, in April of 1862, when their 1 year enlistment had finished, they were free to do what they wanted to do. And the South, at that particular time, had a terrible problem. They were almost without an army. Jackson here in the valley virtually lost his infantry. They all, they all went to the cavalry, because these were farm boys that had horses, and it's a plot, isn't it? These boys had horses, and naturally that by 1862, especially if you were in Jackson's army, you had figured out that riding your horse was a whole lot better than walking, and they had the freedom to do this, and they joined they had to be in the army. The South passed a conscription law that said everybody between 17 and 35 had to be in the army. But they had the freedom to move as they wanted to, and they joined what I call the Ashby Cavalry, Turner Ashby's cavalry outfits. They became members of the 11th Virginia Cavalry, Company E, which also came from the Strasburg area and contained many of the members of the former 10th Virginia Infantry. So these guys are in the army. Now each man furnished his own horse. Each Confederate man furnished his own horse. Of course, the Northern infantry, or the Northern cavalry, was given U.S. horses, but the Confederate fellows furnished their own horse. At that time, Levi, Levi Crisman, Crabill, our guy, had a gray horse valued at $600. Obed had a bay horse valued at $766, and Daniel Borden, their stepfather, also had a bay horse valued at $550. So that gives you some idea of what and if your horse was killed, the Confederate government would pay you that amount for your horse, and you would be sent home on the mission that you've got to have another horse to get back in the cavalry, or you're going to the infantry again. And so these guys are not inner city people, and there are horses around and available, and so they have that availability. When these boys and their stepfather went to war, Priscilla was left at home by herself. She's over here at what we call the Stickley farm, and this is where Gloria Stickley lived. Ralph and Gloria lived for years over there, and before them, of course, the Stickley. Now, it got to be a Stickley farm real quickly, because after the war, after Daniel Borden had died, Priscilla then married a Stickley, Josiah Stickley, who was also...
Her daughter married Josiah Stickley.
Huh?
Her daughter married Josiah Stickley. Betsy
Okay.
marries
Oh, okay. All right. Well, anyway, Josiah then, that's your kin. Okay. Well, Josiah then owned the farm, or they owned the farm, and Obed, who survived the war, moved to Strasbourg and worked here in town. All right. To go to the war, we're going to 1864. Franz Sigel is the appointed federal general. His headquarters at Belgrove. He's massed a large army, and Franz Sigel there's a 5-pronged offensive plan designed by U.S. Grant. And I mean, even though I may be partisan, I would recognize Grant as a mastermind and a competent and a very competent Union officer. But he amassed this plan that said, we're going to march overland to Richmond from the Fredericksburg area, one thing. We're going to have a Red River campaign. We're going to have Sherman march through Georgia. There'll be a campaign along the South Carolina coast, and there will be a campaign in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. And Sigel, a rather incompetent general, as a matter of fact, was selected because of his rank to lead this campaign in Virginia. So he begins his march, and he tramps off, and this David Hunter Strother records that in this diary, and he marches off to Newmarket and Breckenridge on May the 15th, May the 16th there in Newmarket, clobbers him and drives him in great disorder back to Mount Jackson that evening, and they further retreat back to Belgrove. And in a very interesting and unusual method, if you will, on Saturday following, here comes a contingent of guys riding up to Belgrove, and it happens to be Major General Daniel Hunter, I'm sorry, got him wrong. And Hunter walks up to Belgrove, and on the steps of the mansion, he tells Sigel, hey, I'm here to relieve you. And that almost was never done that way, but Grant was a little more harsh than people had been before, and when he decided to make a change, he made a change. And he will do the same thing with Hunter later and put Sheridan in command. But at the time, he was replacing Sigel with Hunter. Now, Hunter was a cruel guy, and Hunter was also from Berkeley Springs, which was then Virginia, Berkeley Springs, Virginia. And he had this thing about him that he thought something ought to be burned every day. And he just wanted to be, he burned a house in Stephen City because some sniper had shot at somebody, and he burned this. And as they leave Strasbourg, and I should give you the date of that. Let me take a look at this. Let's see. On an entry in this diary dated May 26, 1864 says, at the 4 Mile House beyond Strasbourg. Now you all know where that is. That's at the top of Fisher's Hill, and there's a sign on the left. The house sits on the left. It's a white house about across from what we used to call the Valley Diner, and there's a sign that says 4 Mile House, and it's a little welcome sign, like nice brick home, white brick home. And anyway, this quote, at the 4 Mile House beyond Strasbourg, let's see, at the 4 Mile House beyond Strasbourg, the army halted to rest. This is Sigel's army, and this is the chief of staff, right? Looking back, we saw a volume of black smoke rising from the house of Boyden, a farmer. This house was burnt by Colonel George D. Wells, because it was said to be a rendezvous for bushwhackers. And hard by at Fisher's Hill, five men of ours were lately murdered. He called it murdered. Of course, you know, it's gray fighting blue, and it's war. It's not necessarily murder. Levi Crisman Crabill, our hero, had been recuperating from a wound, and in 1864, in the fall of 1864, things in the Confederate Army were in very bad shape. The cavalry was in very bad shape, and the horses and things were being wintered by the soldiers, and Levi and his group were with a group of Confederates, local Confederates, that were camped over on Sandy Hook, over against the mountain, in the area of where the Hinkins place was, which is another mile and a half probably beyond the Stickley home. And Levi was dating and courting a young lady in Strasburg of the Hearn family. There were several daughters, and they lived at what we call the Brillo Brill house, or a house on, which one? Sharp Street, that's right. Pigtail Alley, we used to call it. But Sharp Street, which is this way from here, this off to the southeast of here. Anyhow, he would, and obviously he would visit the Hearn girl at times. Now, as the house is burning, the story is that he showed up. He and a member or two of his group showed up, and they see this going on, and they unload their rifles on these bluecoats there. And it's obviously true, because this guy authenticates that indeed 5 people were murdered there. So they must have killed 5 of them right there at the house. Well, and that's probably right. I did this presentation for some ladies came here. Stickley ladies from Texas came, and they asked me to come tell them what I knew about Levi Crisman Crabill. And one of the ladies that were in that group said, well, you know, I have this story about our great-grandmother, or whatever she was, great-great-grandmother, I'm not sure which. And I'm going to read you this quote that she gave me. Now, this is Priscilla, remember? Priscilla Borden at the time. Priscilla was in the kitchen, which was partially underground with steps coming up to the outside. When the house caught fire, she came out, and the Yankees pushed her back down the stairs and back into the burning building. She reached for a large cooking fork that hung on the wall by the fireplace and hid it in her skirt and headed out again. When the Yankees came for her again, she ran the fork into one. I think it was a separate building and used as a summer kitchen, and still stands to the right of the main house if facing it. Well, now, how can we prove that? I mean, how would you, I mean, that's what they said, and that's what this woman had, and this is the story that was passed down in her family. But I don't know about that. What do you think about that? I mean, does that sound right? Well, if you read a little bit further in this text, this guy is writing he's writing on to Edinburgh. Let's see. Where is it? At any rate, he writes there. I'll find that for you in just a moment. But as you read further in this text, after that woman had told me that, I read further, and on May the 16th, this guy writes, I awoke refreshed. Cannon, wagons, and stragglers were still trailing through the town. I got a wretched meal in the house. In the bar room on one side, I found a long pine box containing the body of a dead soldier, stiff in his bloody garments. On another cot lay a soldier with the death rattle in his throat. On a third cot lay one mortally wounded in the bowels, awaiting a slower death. Well, there's the guy that she stuck with the fork. And this diary proves to me that that account that had been passed down through that family is indeed a true account. And how lucky we really are to have this diary that tells that whole story. So that authenticates the story of the fire and the people being shot there, and the fact that Levi had killed a number of these people. And according to local legend, he even killed more. There was a Yankee that was recuperating in the house at one time who wanted to go swimming, and so Levi took him to the river, and he never came back. He according to the story, he promptly drowned him in the river and let him go. All right. In 1864, finally, Hunter marches on down Burns VMI. You all remember that story, and gets as far as Lynchburg, and Jubal Early is sent to counter that invasion of Southern Territory. Jubal is very successful, drives Hunter over to West Virginia, marches to Washington, D.C., very close to the capital, almost captures the city, and then retires back to the valley. Headquarters in the Winchester area. Sheridan is appointed, and another. Hunter gets sent, I don't know where, but again, Grant has had enough of that general and puts Sheridan in command. So it is now Sheridan in 1864 versus Early. Sheridan, there is a young man in Sheridan's army by the name of Henry Young. And Henry Young is one of the guys who are selected. And what they did, they selected the most gruesome, hard, tough characters, and they became what were known as Young's Rangers. And these guys operated in the valley, and they would wear Confederate uniforms, disguise themselves, and generally wreak havoc in the valley. Well, because of this murder over on Sandy Hook, the 5 guys and the guy stuck with the fork and the whole, I guess that guy died. I don't really know who he was. Probably can find that out. But because of all that, these guys have a mission to catch and or capture and or kill Levi Crisman Crabill. And so indeed they set about that task. And they offer a bounty to anyone who will allow them to, who will put them on to Levi Crisman Crabill. And Levi, rides his horse this direction over here, rides his horse down, crosses the river. He has to ford the river. That's only a ford there and then, not a bridge as we know now. And he fords the river, comes up to what we call the Schoolhouse Hill, and makes a left and goes right down around the corner to the Hearn house to visit his sweetheart. And he does that, I guess, often, I would think. I'm not sure, but I would think often. And somebody, according to the story, and now I can't prove this part, but according to a member of the family, by the way, a member of the Crabill, Levi Crisman Crabill family. Yes.
Oh, the Hearn family. Oh my God.
No. According to a member of the Crabill family, one of the members of the Hearn family turned him in. And a contingent of these Young's Rangers waited for him and ambushed him as he started down the hill to recross the river and go back to his camp one afternoon. And he shot one of them there, as the story goes. And they chased him. He forded the river, and he got to the edge of Francis Hoover's Hill. And if you go across Sandy Hook, you go around the big turn, the North Fork, or the Signal Knob Middle School sets on your left, and you start up a hill. Just as you start up that hill, at the end of that hill is a White House, which was Francis Hoover's home. There used to be a large rock right there at the side of the road, and they always told me that's the spot where Levi Crisman Crabill was shot in the back and wounded. And his horse carried him on to his camp in the mountain, and he was then taken to Woodstock, but died a couple of days later. The body was brought back to Strasburg and was buried at the farm. And I'm going to tell you all how to look for this, but anyhow, he's buried at the farm. And I assume the guy's got the reward. I'm not sure who which Hearn turned him in, but one of these Hearns turned him in and collected a bounty of about $600, as I understand, $400 to $600. And there was apparently plenty of money to do it. Now, interestingly, these Young's Rangers there's very little known about them. They're secretive guys. But during the Edinburgh raid, these people she's an Edinburgh girl. During the Edinburgh raid in December of 1864, later, there was a running attack gathered up by Captain Grandstaff from Edinburgh, and they chased these guys down the Valley Pike, and they wounded one of these characters at Fisher's Hill. This guy, and you wonder, could that story be true? Is that possible? But I have a regimental history from this guy's original regiment where he joined the Young's Rangers, and in there's a letter from George Hupp, who lived on the Pike out here on which was just north of the town at that time, about a half a mile north of the town. And George Hupp writes in there that he thinks he ought to get some rations because he's poor and does not, have enough to eat, and he's worried he's not going to make it. He's apparently a fairly shrewd guy, as a matter of fact, because later in the official records of the armies, Sheridan himself writes a letter back to the guy that's distributing the rations, and it says, "Don't give any to Hupp, don't give any to Hupp because he's got a sword that belongs to Stonewall Jackson and $10,000 hidden under the floor." Well, the only way that information could have been passed is this guy that was wounded out here, that was taken there wounded and stayed in the house, could tell that tale. And that's the only guy, and that proves these Young's Rangers. To wind this story down, Obed is wounded in the jaw. He is shot through the jaw, the ball going through his face, coming out his cheek. That's the brother. And he survives the war. Of course, Levi's buried over here and I was going to tell you where the grave is. If you go south on US 11 here, you know what we call the bend of the river. When the river comes real close to the highway out here, before you get there, about 200 yards back this way, look to your left over in the field, and you'll see a little square graveyard, a couple trees sticking up, and that's the burial place where, where Levi is buried, and alongside him buried there is his mother, Priscilla. Only 2 graves in this little graveyard, but it is maintained. The Ralph Stickley people own that land yet, and that grave is maintained by them. There's a little wooden fence around it, and the 2 gravestones are cleaned and kept well. So you can go see Levi, the genuine hero, where he's buried, and his mother is buried there as well. Let's see if there's anything else I should tell you about that. The guy who was shot at Fisher's Hill and went and recuperated at Hupp's was Billy White. Okay, and he rode 12 miles toward Winchester, following the wound. That's what George Hupp says. He reported that White rode 12 miles toward Winchester. This is from Edinburgh, following his wound, and was taken off his horse at my house. And an entry later, this Billy White, just to go on about him, died in California of those wounds. He survived the war, but died later of those wounds. Anything else I should tell you?
Tell the horse story.
What's that? Oh, the horse, yeah. Apparently, they decided that Levi Crisman Crabill's horse should be given to the Hearn girl, whichever one she was. But a horse in the fall of 1864 was a very valuable commodity, and also a very likely warning that a Confederate was around. So according to local legend, which I believe, the horse was hidden in the basement, and granny sack bags were put on its feet and tied around it so that if it clumped, it wouldn't make enough noise that passing Federal troops who occupied the town of Strasburg, so that they would not hear this horse and would not come get this horse. I'm sorry? At the Hearn house. Mm-hmm. Or Brillo Brill's house. We used to call him Brillo as Harry Brillo Brill, whose grocery store is on the spot we are in right now. This used to be Brill's grocery right here. And that fella lived up on Sharp Street, as Mary says, and raised his family there, and among whom was the Hearn ladies. Luther Hearn was a minister, I think, in town. Is buried in the old Strasburg graveyard up here on Queen Street. So that's our attachment to all these guys. Levi Crisman Crabill. She wanted me to tell you some story that is of local interest, and so that's Levi, the story of Levi. Anybody have any questions about it? I mean, any other questions about the whole thing, or about Civil War in Strasburg, or people from Strasburg? I'll do what I can.
I got lost on the guy who was wounded. Was he a Yankee?
Which one?
The one that was the most recent story you were telling, wounded at Fisher's Hill?
Oh, yeah, he was a Yankee.
He was a Yankee.
That was Billy White. And Billy White was shot. Finally, when your Grandstaff's guys catch him at the foot of Fisher's Hill, there's a running gunfight there. Billy White is wounded, and he rides to George Hupp's house.
Got it.
And George Hupp then cares for him until the army comes through, and they take him to back to the hospital in Winchester, and he recovers. Yeah, or somewhat. Well, actually, he is, as I think I'm right to say that he was transferred to the hospital in Winchester, a field hospital there, and then on to the hospital in Washington, D.C. Released from that, the war's over, and he migrates to California, but dies soon after. Soon after that. Yes, ma'am.
Did the Valley Pike go through Fisher's Hill back then?
Yes, ma'am.
So what did it?
It went around.
All right, if you follow the Valley Pike here, this is the Valley Pike, right here. And this is the original road bed,
Okay.
right there. If you follow it on the right-hand side of the road, when it splits out there, all right, when the highway splits, you're on the original road bed until you get almost to Tumbling Run, and the Valley Pike was a little further to the right. And there's old bridge abutments there. The pike went right into the steep part of the hill, right to where the hill's the highest. It went right into that hill, and right across Tumbling Run, made a very sharp angled right hand turn and continued probably 300-400 yards up the hill and then went up through the hollow. Nowadays it goes straight up the hill, but at that time it went right into the hill, made a right turn, went up and wound up through the hollow and came out where the trailer park is up on top of the hill.
Okay. And
Okay.
how did it get back to like where 11 is now? Or how did it go to Tom's Brook?
Well, it came back onto the original roadbed up at the trailer park. That's on the Crabill farm at the top of the hill, and then followed that onto Tom's Brook by the 4 Mile House into Tom's Brook. And if you go out of Tom's Brook, when you're going to Marytown, for instance, if you see where had that long piece of road that is off to the right, that's the original road. The newer road is the highway you travel on, but the old little piece down through there is the original pike. Yeah, and it's like that all the way through. I mean, there's pieces of it out here and there. The old road exists. Now, the old road was less than 1 lane of this road wide, so a small road. But in 1850, believe it or not, in 1850 it was probably the most modern road in America because it had just been built, and the interesting thing is that it was said to have been built with graded approaches and culverts, which were not ordinary prior to that time. You had to go down, ford the creek, and come up. And so hauling freight or wagon traffic and stuff was very difficult until they built the Valley Pike with culverts and level where the animals could pull the wagons and whatnot with ease across the Valley Pike. And Strasburg's important feature then was that the Manassas Gap Railroad came to Strasburg and on to Mount Jackson, but at Strasburg is where the Manassas Gap Railroad joined the Valley Pike. And so if you could get your produce or your whatever to Strasburg, you could also put it on the railroad. And the railroad would carry it to the market in Alexandria or Washington, D.C., or wherever you're trying to export your goods. And so farmers in this area did well, with the ability to transport their crops and sell things in the market down east from here without transporting them all by wagon. Okay, make any sense? But when you go out of town, you're going to go by the old mill, historic old mill. Out there, the highway, you're going to get to where you can see the highway's going to double. Right there, look over to the left, because over in that field, you'll see, when you look across the river, the field will slope up a little bit, and there in the field, you'll see this little copse of trees, and there is Levi Stickley's, Levi, yeah. You can see that grave from the road there, and that is Levi Crisman Crabill's grave. If you want to visit the grave, you go across the river take the first road on the right, the little gravel lane goes all the way back. Go back until you make the sharp turn to the left. There's a barn sits there. Walk out along the barn, and you'll see you have to go down through a fence, I think, but you'll see that little graveyard there. You can walk up and read the stones. And as far as I know, Ralph welcomes that. He's okay with that, I think.
Who owns the Stigley house?
I'm not sure who bought that house. Maybe Tim knows. But Ralph and Gloria, of course, built a newer home and sold that house that the Crabills lived in. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, anybody else? You good? You got it? Anybody? Yes?
On the Martown stretch that you were talking about, there used to be, and I guess it's still there, a sign giving the mileage to Miller and Rhodes in Richmond.
Oh, I didn't know that.
How about that for trivia?
I did not know that. That's interesting. But whenever I do a Civil War tour of the area, I always take people to that little piece of road up there, because if they want to know what did the Valley Pike look like, it looked like that. I mean, and it's that wide. It's a narrow little thing. Nowadays, it's tarred and graveled, but in that day it was a stone macadam finished road, which is small stones sifted into large stones, which is and a very good surface. And at that time, the middle road became the road where livestock was transported, because the middle road was an unpaved road, was not macadam, and it's much easier on the animal hooves to travel on dirt than on stone. And so they more or less stayed to the middle road, which ran through Fisher's Hill, right through the community of Fisher's Hill and on out through. Largely interrupted in today's time by 81. The construction of 81 has blocked up a lot of what used to be the old middle road. Anybody else? Levi Crisman Crabill. And his brother Obed, as I say, is buried in, Obed was a merchant in Strasburg after the war, successful guy. And Obed is buried in the Presbyterian churchyard.
Did he have children, Obed?
Obed did, yes. Obed did. There are descendants of Obed. There was supposed to be, according to this lady, who would not tell me, she told me she knew which of the Hearns turned him in. But she would never tell me that. She said, I'll never tell you that. And I said, well, I'm looking for a picture of Levi Crisman Crabill. And she said, I think I have one. But I never got it. And she passed away. I asked her son. He doesn't know anything about it. They didn't care much about that stuff. And I guess it all got discarded. And so there is, as far as I know, no picture of him that survives. The father, there is a picture of their father, but none of these boys. There is a picture of Levi Crabill, the old man. Some legend, but that legend is substantiated in this guy's diary. And I think, and I think the story of her stabbing the guy with the fork is great. And but anyway, and you know, but it's interesting that that would make an impression on the chief of staff, because he's got a lot of stuff to do, but he writes that in his diary, and it's in here. And this is a reprint of that diary. A Virginia Yankee in the Civil War, the diaries of David Hunter Strother. And David Hunter Strother was named after Daniel Hunter and was his nephew, and that's why he was his chief of staff. So, you know, a little favoritism, nepotism going on in the Army at the time.
I heard that when they remodeled over there one time in that house, that there were burn scars.
Yes. Oh yeah. Yeah. One of those the ladies that came from Texas, and I can't remember.
Kay Corregan.
Okay, whoever they were, she wrote me that as a young girl or something, she had been there and crawled around in the house and found where it had been, you could see where it was burned.
So Josiah, she's a descendant of one of Josiah Stickley's. 3 of his children went to Texas, to
Okay.
Canadian Texas. And
Okay.
followed their uncle, Josiah's brother,
Okay.
who went to start the town in Canadian, or helped start it anyway. They went to
Okay.
Texas, and that's how come they came back here, all of them.
Okay. Anybody else? A lot of fun. Confederate history.
You're saying that there were Yankees in Young, and they were traveling around raiding things
Yes.
as a group of criminal raiders?
Well, let me see. I didn't read the whole thing here, but let me give you that. No, let's see. Let's see here. I've got that.
They weren't the
All right.
guys that were burning the house down.
All right, here we go. On April 30, 1863, Major Henry Harrison Young is appointed to Philip Sheridan's staff. His duties included the title Chief of Scouts. The Scouts were a 58-man band of men specially selected for duty that included irregular warfare tactics such as wearing enemy uniforms and providing long-range reconnaissance behind enemy lines. They were also charged with killing or capturing Confederate bushwhackers that were a constant problem as Sheridan's army operated in the valley during 1864. So they were to combat that.
Now, how would they be treated if they were captured? Are
They'd
they
be,
prisoners of war or
they'd
spies?
probably be hung.
Yeah.
They'd probably
that
be
was a
hung.
dangerous thing to do.
Yes, it was very, and they selected old Billy. If you read that unit history, the history Billy was in, or the unit he was in before he became one of Young's scouts, he's always in trouble. He's off drunk somewhere, or he's fighting at something. And I mean, he's just one of those carousy type characters that stays in trouble. But he's selected to be one of these scouts, and sure enough, he is, and he's the guy wounded out here at Fisher's Hill. But yeah, they're a rough and tumble group of guys. Not much unlike Mosby's Rangers, as a matter of fact. I mean, Mosby's guys were nearly the same thing, and so I mean, and it was irregular warfare. Ambush type things, you know.
Yankees version of Mosby's Rangers?
Well, they were a lot like that, yeah. Mm-hmm. There was also another one, Jesse Scouts were with Fremont. When Fremont in 1862 was in the valley, he had a unit also, and they were called Jesse Scouts, named after his wife, Jessie Fremont. And they did the same sort of thing. There's always that sort of thing going on. Yeah.
Were there any other native locals that knew the area well? And
No, these guys were Pennsylvania. This Billy was Pennsylvania. I'm not sure they all were, but Billy was Pennsylvania. But Mosby's guys operated in an area they knew well. And out here in this area, we had McNeil's Rangers that came from Hardy County, West Virginia, and Shenandoah County, and notably Dr. Triplett, that was the wealthy guy in Mount Jackson, was a member of McNeil's Rangers and was a partisan ranger at the time. They were not very favorably looked on by either side, even their own side. Even General Lee said, you know, we ought to disband this and we ought not conduct this kind of warfare. But it continued. And Lee went on to disband all of these ranger outfits excepting Mosby and McNeil.
he wants to
leaving
keep it
those
a
two.
war instead of a criminal activity.
Yeah.
He wants to be viewed as a country against a country instead of a country fighting off criminals.
Right. Mm-hmm. And many of the Mosby things, I mean, if you read a lot of the Mosby things, many of those things are almost criminal activities. I mean, Mosby is Mosby, he's famous, but he was not Snow White either. So, you know, it is what war is like that, and it's tough. We're watching that on TV these days, and it's not a pleasant. And you know, you got to understand that that's a subject for another day. But the burning of this valley was as bad to this valley as what is going on in Ukraine is to Ukraine. And this place was destroyed, and I mean destroyed and almost unfit to live in. And that's why people after the war, including my great-grandmother, who's mentioned in a diary, they had to go to Martinsburg and beg for rations to feed their families following the Civil War. And that's where this story about Hupp out here saying, I need my rations, and Sheridan writes back, don't give Hupp rations. He's got Jackson. I don't know what happened to the sword, but you know, I've asked the Hupp family, where is Jackson's sword? I'd like to have that. But I'm not able to find that. They don't seem to know about that. But the little house still sits out there with the frontier fort. They're on the left side of the pike. The house on the right side is one of the son's house who was in the Army, as a matter of fact. And see, old man Hupp is caring for this federal guy. At the same time, he's got two sons in the Army, in the Confederate Army. And so, I mean, that's the way they were gentlemen as well. And, you know, if you're wounded, and we'll take care of you. And you deserve to be taken care of, which is somewhat better than we're doing in Ukraine.
Although Russian soldiers are caring for some
Are they?
citizens that they find, yeah, they are.
Well, that's good.
Yeah.
Well, at least they're a little bit humane.
Yeah, and they're like, we didn't sign up for this.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I was reading the Denny last night about Talbot and Front Royal, non-combatant, 300-page, written in 1917 or something like that. And he describes the line going back and forth across Front Royal and how they would have to entertain the Yankees and bring them in to the houses and feed them. And
Oh, yeah.
the Confederates would come in, and he describes how they had to go about getting out of the infantry, just like you said, because they could all ride horses, and they had horses. They quickly figured out that they wanted to be in the cavalry.
That's right. I mean, and that is right. And, you know, Jackson probably had 5,000 men when he went to Port Republic and at the beginning of the Jackson Valley campaign. But before he left Port Republic, he only had 2,600. The rest had gone to the cavalry. I mean, it was a mass migration because their enlistments were all up in April or May of 1862, and they had fulfilled that commitment they'd made as infantry soldiers, and it was legal to jump over into the cavalry, and they did that because they had horses, and it's the perfectly right thing to do and a whole lot easier on your legs. I mean, you know.
They said initially they had wonderful horses, but simple things like canteens and packs and good spurs and horse stirrups and all that stuff really wasn't military. And as they engaged the enemy, they could take the enemy's stuff and
Well, yeah.
They just borrow.
Oh, yeah. The Confederate Army lived on captured Union goods. I mean, that's a matter of fact.
We're gonna take
Yeah.
them back.
I heard that people were happy when the Yankees were in town because there was food.
Yes. The Bell Pottery lady had a famous quote. She baked bread for the Yankees as they occupied the town of Strasburg near the turn of the year in 1864, 1865. And there's a quote she had that said, "When the Yankees are at town, at least I know my family has food before I bake for the Union Army." And she baked bread, or whatever she baked, and obviously had saved a little for her own children. And it was a, and I do have a diary from kinfolk in Middletown that talk about my great-grandmother stopping there on her way to Martinsburg to beg for rations. She lived at Murraytown, Psalmsville, actually. And there's a mention in that diary of her being there for that purpose. So it was pretty tough. Not every single thing was burned, but there was a tremendous devastation.
Is it true that the mill was not burned? The old mill?
The old mill was not burned.
And that was because of
Well, they used it to grind their own flour. The Union Army did, and for that reason saved it. That's the story I hear.
I heard a story about it was because they were Masons.
Because they were what?
Masons?
Maybe. I'm not sure. That may have.
The story was that the women in Strasburg implored Sheridan not to
Yeah.
burn it down.
That's the one I.
Well, and the same is true of the Edinburgh mill. I mean, if you, and that one was say there's here one, there one, but there were, I don't know if I'd say hundreds, but great numbers of mills were burned, and hundreds of barns, and haystacks, and pigs driven off, and cows driven off, and all that. You know, that drove all the livestock off or killed it. If a soldier saw a chicken, he'd kill that, strap it across the horse. They'd eat that tonight, you know, and that's the way they lived. So, y'all had enough?
Sit there and talk all day.
It's been fun.
Let's give the man a hand.
It's